What if the cruelest joke anyone ever played on a man turned into the thing that broke an entire territory wide open? That's not a riddle. That's exactly what happened in Dustfall Creek, New Mexico, in the fall of 1879. There was a rancher. His name was Caleb Arden, 41 years old. Weathered face, quiet voice, the kind of man who could go a full week without saying more than 12 words to another human being. He ran a small spread, about 900 acres of dry grass land out past the ridge, with 3 cowboys, who mostly felt sorry for him, and a herd of 140 head of cattle that looked about as lonely as he did. He had never married, not because he didn't want to. He just didn't know how to want anything out loud. And in Dustfall Creek, that made him a target, because the town had a particular kind of cruelty in it. The kind that wears a smile, the kind that shakes your hand at church on Sunday, and then laughs about you at the saloon by Monday night. The men who ran that town, the Harwick family specifically, had decided Caleb Arden needed a wife. Not because they cared about him, because they wanted to watch something break. They sent for a mail-order bride, paid for it themselves, chose her deliberately. Her name was Margaret Louise Holt, and she came from a farm outside of Wichita, Kansas. 34 years old, broad shoulders, heavy frame, the kind of woman who had spent her life being told she was too much, too big, too loud, too capable for any man to truly want. They put her on a stagecoach and sent her west, and they told half the town what was coming, so there'd be a proper audience for the humiliation. Here's what they didn't account for. Margaret Louise Holt had been surviving cruelty her entire life, and she had gotten very, very good at it. She stepped off that stagecoach in the dust and the October heat, and she looked at Caleb Arden, this silent, sun-worn man holding a bent flower he'd clearly picked off the side of the road because he had no idea what else to do. And she didn't see the joke. She saw a man who showed up. That's a detail worth sitting with, because in 1879, in the middle of nowhere, New Mexico, a man who shows up, even badly, even awkwardly, even with a half-dead roadside flower, was already ahead of almost every other man in that territory. She took the flower. She said, "I like the yellow ones," and she meant it. The crowd waiting for something to fall apart got nothing. Not that day. But the story, the real story, was only just beginning. Caleb Arden's ranch didn't have a name when Margaret arrived. He'd never thought to give it one. That was the first thing she changed. She called it the A-Bar Ranch. Simple, clean. Hers. She didn't ask permission. She just had a man from the hardware store painted on a wooden board and drove 2 posts into the ground at the entrance herself, while Caleb stood nearby holding a hammer he hadn't been asked to use. He watched her do it. He didn't say a word, but something in the set of his jaw shifted, something that looked, if you were paying attention, like relief. What Margaret had brought with her wasn't soft. She hadn't packed dresses for the West. She'd packed tools, seeds, a ledger book, and 3 years' worth of notes she'd made at her father's farm about cattle grazing patterns, water usage, and soil turnover. Observations her father had never bothered to read because she was his daughter, not his business partner. By the end of her first week on that ranch, she'd done 3 things. She'd identified that Caleb's herd was grazing the same pasture in a rotation that was stripping the topsoil bare, which meant by spring, he'd lose roughly 1/3 of his feeding capacity. She'd noticed the creek that ran along the east edge of the property wasn't being used for irrigation at all, even though the water level was sufficient. And she'd found a ledger error from his previous season that had cost him $400 in a cattle sale to a buyer named Norris out of Santa Fe, money that had simply been miscounted and poculated by the trader. She didn't bring these things to Caleb in a meeting. She didn't make a proposal. She just started doing things differently. She moved the herd to the western pasture, and let the eastern one rest. She dug a channel by hand, 230 feet of it, over the course of 9 days, with help from one of the cowboys, a young man named Ezra, who was so surprised a woman was willing to dig that he'd grabbed a shovel before he'd even thought about it. As for the ledger error, she wrote a letter to the buyer in Santa Fe. Formal, precise, not angry, just correct. He sent back $70 and an apology. She filed the remaining discrepancy for later. By November, the ranch was running differently. Not dramatically. Not yet. But the way a body runs differently after you set a broken bone. Quietly, with less waste. And Dustfall Creek was watching. Now, here's where you have to understand something about small western towns in the post-Civil War years. The economy of gossip was everything. People didn't have newspapers reporting on each other's business. They had eyes and mouths and porches, and the currency they traded in was who was falling behind and who was pulling ahead. Margaret Arden, she'd taken his name without ceremony, signed the county record herself on the second day after arriving, was beginning to accumulate a certain kind of attention, not the kind the Harwicks had planned on. By mid-December, she had learned the name of every cattle buyer within a 40-mile radius, the price per head at each of the 3 nearest trading posts, and the current going rates for beef in both Albuquerque and El Paso. She'd done this by talking to people, by sitting in the dry goods store and listening, by asking questions at the post office that seemed casual, but were, in fact, exactly the questions that needed asking. Caleb watched all of this with the specific silence of a man who is watching something he doesn't understand, but deeply recognizes. He'd been a rancher for 16 years. He knew cattle, he knew grass and weather, and the particular way a steer moves when it's sick. But he had never, not once, treated the ranch like a business. Margaret treated everything like a business. Not coldly, but with the particular sharp attention of someone who understands that resources are finite, and mistakes are expensive, and the land doesn't care about your feelings. One evening in January, she sat across from him at the kitchen table, a table she'd moved because the previous placement got no morning light, and she pushed the ledger toward him. "We're going to need more land," she said. He looked at the numbers. He'd never seen them laid out like that. "We're turning a profit," he said, surprised. "We're turning a small profit," she corrected. "A storm takes out 20 head, a drought hits, Norris decides to cut his price. We're back to nothing. We need buffer. We need scale." He looked up at her. "Where?" "The Callaway spread is struggling," she said. "Holt Callaway hasn't paid his water rights in 2 seasons. He's going to lose the southern quarter, probably by April." "How do you know that?" "I asked his wife," she said simply. "There's a question I want to ask you right now, and I want you to think about it seriously. Have you ever watched someone see something clearly that everyone else around them was choosing to ignore? Because that's what Caleb Arden was experiencing. And it's one of the most disorienting things that can happen to a person, especially when the person seeing clearly is someone the world told you to dismiss." He didn't argue. He asked what she needed. She needed 3 things: his signature on a land offer, his presence at the bank meeting in Taos, and for him to please stop apologizing to people for things that weren't his fault. He gave her all 3. The Callaway quarter came through in March, $22 per acre, 640 acres. It stretched their credit to the edge, but Margaret had already calculated the grazing expansion and the expected herd growth and the projected sale price of beef through the following 2 seasons, based on cattle movement patterns she'd been tracking across the region. The Harwicks heard about the land purchase on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Chester Harwick, the oldest of the 3 brothers who ran the family's interests, came by the ranch personally. He was a big man, wide through the shoulders, wore a coat that cost more than most people in Dustfall Creek made in a month. He had the easy authority of someone who has never been told no by anyone who mattered. He rode up to the house while Margaret was on the porch, going through a supply manifest. He looked down at her from his horse, the way people look down at things they've decided are temporary. "Mrs. Arden," he said, "heard you picked up the Callaway quarter." "We did," she said, without looking up from the manifest. "Interesting move for a small operation." "We're not small," she said. And then she looked up. She didn't smile. She didn't bristle. She just looked at him with the particular steadiness of someone who has been underestimated so many times. It has become, functionally, a strategic advantage. "We'll need access through your northern road for the spring drive," Chester said. "That'll be $30 for the season." This was a toll he'd never charged Caleb before. They both knew it. "No," Margaret said. Chester's horse shifted. "Excuse me? The northern road runs along the county surveyor boundary. It's not your land to toll. I checked the deed records in Taos." She set down the manifest. "But I'm happy to pay you $20 if you'll extend the seasonal fence post agreements from last year. I think that's a fair trade." Chester Harwick had not, in his adult life, been negotiated with by a woman in her own front yard. He stared at her for what felt like a long time. Then he said, "25. 22 and a handshake," she said. He took the deal. He never quite understood why. Later, men in the saloon would say he'd been rattled. He'd deny it. But they weren't wrong. That interaction, small in itself, traveled through Dustfall Creek the way important information always travels in small towns. Fast, slightly distorted, and with a weight that was impossible to explain until you understood the context. Margaret Arden had told Chester Harwick no, and walked away with more than she started with. Now I need you to subscribe to this channel, because we are 40 minutes into this story, and we haven't even gotten to the drought, the fire, the land war with the railroad, or the moment Margaret walked into a cattle auction in Albuquerque and bought 600 head while every man in the room watched with their mouths open. And if you miss those parts, you'll be walking away from one of the best things you've seen this week. Hit subscribe. It takes 2 seconds. We'll be right here when you get back. The summer of 1880 was the driest in 12 years. It didn't announce itself dramatically. It started as a late spring, slower rains, warmer nights. By June, it was clear something was wrong. By July, the creek running along the east edge of the A-bar was down to a trickle. This is where the channel Margaret had dug in her first winter became the difference between a ranch that survived and a ranch that didn't. She'd also done something that seemed strange to people at the time. She'd started buying small shares in a water rights collective out of Mora County, just east of the territory. Not a large stake, enough to give the A-bar access to a secondary water claim during shortage periods. No other small ranch in the area had done this. The Harwicks had tried, but Chester had balked at the collective structure. He didn't like sharing access with strangers. Margaret had no problem sharing access with strangers. Strangers were just people you hadn't negotiated with yet. By August, 4 ranches within 20 miles of Dustfall Creek had lost significant portions of their herds. The Callaway remnant, what was left of the family after they'd sold the southern quarter, lost nearly everything. 3 other operations were looking at bankruptcy. The A-bar lost 19 head. 19 out of a herd that had grown, by that point, to just under 300. This was not luck. This was the particular outcome of decisions made 18 months earlier that most people hadn't noticed because they didn't look like dramatic decisions. They looked like a woman digging a ditch. They looked like a small ledger entry for water rights shares. They looked like boring, practical, unglamorous work. The most important moves rarely look important while you're making them. By September, Margaret was in a position no one in Dustfall Creek had expected her to be in. She had capital, water access, and surviving cattle at a moment when her neighbors had almost none of those things. She bought 2 ranches that fall, both of them voluntary sales. She didn't force anyone's hand. She paid fair prices, prices that were higher than what the Harwicks were offering for the same properties. This was a calculation, not charity. She understood something about the West that the Harwicks had never bothered to learn. The people you buy from become your neighbors for the rest of your life, and your neighbors will either help you or hurt you, depending on how they remember the transaction. Both families she bought from stayed on as employees of the A-Bar. She gave them wages, housing, and a stake in the herd's growth. This was essentially unheard of at the time. Ranchers didn't give stakes to ranch hands. Margaret Arden didn't have ranch hands. She had partners she was paying salaries to while the partnership formalized. Ezra, the young cowboy who'd grabbed a shovel back in that first winter, had become, by this point, her foreman. He'd received a 2% stake in the A-Bar operation the previous year in lieu of a wage increase. He'd thought she was joking. She wasn't. When the drought broke in October, the A-Bar had grown from 900 acres to just under 3,000. The herd was at 278 head, and Margaret Arden was no longer a curiosity. She was becoming something the territory didn't entirely have a category for. Caleb, where was Caleb through all of this? He was there, every day, every decision, every drive and fence repair and branding and sale. But the nature of his presence had changed in a way that was hard for people in Dustfall Creek to articulate. He was not a passive husband. He wasn't standing in the background looking decorative. He worked the ranch as hard as he ever had. Harder, actually, because there was more to work, and he finally understood what the work was building toward. But he had done something rare, something that men in that era, in that territory, almost never did. He had decided that being right mattered less than being useful. He was the one who knew the land, the precise quirks of the soil in the western pasture, the way the wind came down off the ridge in March, which cattle roats flooded in a hard spring. Margaret had the strategy. He had the terrain knowledge, and somewhere in their first winter together, they had quietly, without fanfare or declaration, figured out that these two things were not in competition. They made decisions together at that kitchen table in the morning light. Some days, she overruled him. Some days, he flat out refused to proceed with something until he understood it. Once, in a disagreement about whether to sell their bull stock early to capitalize on a price spike, he'd stood up and said, "Margaret, I know this bull. He's worth more than that number." And then he'd sat back down. She'd waited. She'd asked him to explain. He had. And then she'd changed the plan. That was their dynamic. Not easy. Not always comfortable. But real. And I think it's worth asking here. Drop it in the comments if you want. What does it say about a relationship when both people are willing to be wrong? When neither one needs the credit? Think about it, because that question is going to matter later. By 1882, the Arden operation controlled just over 8,000 acres across 4 connected properties. This was the moment the railroad got interested. The Southern Pacific was pushing a spur line through the territory that year, and the proposed route ran directly through the eastern edge of what was now A-Bar land. This was the kind of thing that had ended other ranching operations. Railroads had the power of eminent domain. They had lawyers. They had political connections in the territorial government. And they had a very established habit of offering landowners below market value and then making the alternative look worse. The railroad's local representative was a man named J.B. Forrest. He arrived in Dustfall Creek in April with 2 assistants and a leather satchel full of documents. He went first to the town council, which was largely controlled by the Harwicks, and then he went to see the largest landowner in the immediate region. That was Margaret Arden. He expected a straightforward meeting. He would lay out the terms. She would accept or make a modest counteroffer. And then he would report back to the main office that the route was clear. He had never, in 12 years of land acquisition work for the railroad, dealt with a woman who'd spent the previous 3 years preparing for this kind of conversation. Margaret had a surveyor's report. She had a water rights map. She had a document outlining the economic impact to the A-bar operation of the proposed route. Cattle drive access disruption, fencing costs, risk to the water channel on the eastern boundary, calculated to the dollar over a 5-year period. And she had an alternative. "I'm not opposed to the railroad," she told Forrest. They were sitting in her kitchen. She had made coffee. She had not offered him anything else. "I'm opposed to this route." She laid out a map on the table and pointed to a corridor that was 23 degrees south of the proposed line. "This route avoids the water boundary conflict. It avoids the Henderson family's access road, which is going to cause you legal trouble with the county, by the way, if you haven't checked. And it puts the spur depot within 2 miles of the Dustfall Creek town center, which means the railroad gets more freight business, not less." Forrest looked at the map for a long time. "Who drew this?" he asked. "I did," she said. What happened next is the kind of thing that doesn't make it into most official records, but survives in the letters and diaries of people who were there. J.B. Forrest sat in Margaret Arden's kitchen for 3 hours. He wrote back to the main office recommending the alternate route. The Southern Pacific adopted it. The Spur Line depot opened 14 months later, 2 miles from Dustfall Creek. The A-Bar Ranch was the first operation with a contract to ship cattle directly from the depot. Chester Harwick didn't get a contract that first year. He found out about it on a Tuesday. The fire came in 1884. It started on the western edge of the property. Dry summer grass, a lightning strike, and a wind that made no promises. By the time anyone knew it had started, it was already covering ground faster than horses could reliably race it. Margaret had done something that, again, had seemed strange at the time she'd done it. 2 years prior, she had put in a series of breaks, cleared strips of land, roughly 12 feet wide, at intervals across the western and northern sections of the ranch. Her foreman, Ezra, had questioned the labor cost. She'd told him it was insurance. He'd accepted this because by that point, he'd learned that her reasoning, even when it wasn't obvious, was almost always correct. The fire reached the first break and slowed. It reached the second one and lost its north vector. It still burned 240 acres of pasture and took 11 structures, equipment sheds, 2 hay barns, a bunkhouse that fortunately sat empty that night. But the herd, 1,400. Head, by that point, was driven east through the creek corridor and held on the neighboring Caldwell property, which Margaret had leased the previous year for exactly this kind of contingency. No cattle died. No people died. 3 neighboring ranches were not as lucky. The Harwicks' western grazing land burned entirely. 300 acres they couldn't afford to lose. Chester Harwick had never bothered with fire breaks because he'd never needed them before, and the certainty that you don't need something is one of the most expensive certainties in the world. After the fire, Margaret organized a recovery effort across the affected ranches. Not charity, coordination, shared fencing materials at wholesale, labor exchange agreements, a collectively funded rebuild of the road that connected the western properties to the main route. Chester Harwick, who had spent 5 years watching her with something between contempt and unease, accepted help from Margaret Arden. He didn't thank her. He also never interfered with her operation again. The thing about survival, real survival, not the dramatic kind, but the grinding, year after year kind, is that it changes the moral architecture of a town. People start arranging themselves differently around the people who know how to not die. By 1886, the A-Bar Ranch covered just over 22,000 acres and ran 3,200 head of cattle. It employed 47 people and had a dedicated cattle shipping contract with the Southern Pacific, worth more in a single season than most ranches in the territory made in 5 years. It was, by any measurement, the largest cattle operation in that part of New Mexico. And here is where the story does something unexpected. Because the Harwicks, reduced now from town kings to large but struggling operations, had a daughter. Her name was Clara Harwick, 19 years old, the youngest child of Chester. And she had been watching Margaret Arden since she was 10 years old, not with contempt, with attention. In the spring of 1886, Clara Harwick walked up to the main house at the A-Bar Ranch, 2 stories now, with a covered porch and a working water pump, and knocked on the front door. Margaret answered herself. "I want to learn," Clara said. She didn't say what she wanted to learn. She didn't need to. Margaret looked at her for a moment. Then she stepped back from the doorway. "Come in," she said. "We're just starting the morning accounts." Chester Harwick found out his daughter was working as a business apprentice at the A-Bar Ranch on a Tuesday. By this point in his life, finding things out on Tuesdays had become so common, he'd stopped being surprised. What did you think of Clara walking in like that? Let me know in the comments. Would you have had that courage at 19? By 1889, 10 years after Margaret Louise Holt stepped off a stagecoach in Dustfall Creek, holding herself with the particular dignity of a woman who knew exactly what was being done to her and had decided it didn't matter, the A-Bar Ranch was not just the largest cattle operation in the territory, it was a model. 3 other ranches had adopted the water rights collective structure she'd pioneered. The fire break system had become the informal standard for any serious operation in the region. The labor stake model, workers holding small ownership percentages, had spread to 4 other employers in the county. Margaret had not lobbied for any of this. She had not written pamphlets or given speeches. She had simply built something that worked well enough that people stopped looking for reasons to ignore it. In October of that year, the Albuquerque Daily Citizen ran a piece on the growth of cattle operations in the region. It mentioned the A-Bar in passing, the Arden operation, which has seen notable expansion under the management of Mrs. Margaret Arden, and got several details wrong. Margaret read it once, folded it up, and put it in her ledger as a bookmark. Caleb read it and said, "They spelled your name right." She said, "They did." He said, "That's something." She said, "It's something." And that was the entirety of the celebration. Here's what I want you to carry out of this story. Not a set of business lessons. That's not what this is. What I want you to carry is something harder than a lesson. Margaret Arden didn't succeed because she was given a chance. She was given a trap, a humiliation wrapped in a mail-order bride form. And she walked into it with her tools, her ledger, her seeds, and her ability to look at broken things without flinching. She didn't win by being better than everyone else in some abstract, superior way. She won by doing something most people in her position would not have done. She took the situation seriously. The ground, the water, the numbers, the people. She took it all seriously at a moment when everyone around her had decided she was a joke. And here is the part that most stories about remarkable people leave out. It was hard. Not once in a while, continuously. There were seasons where the ledger numbers were close enough to bad that sleep was difficult. There were negotiations that didn't go her way. There was a spring when the herd dropped 28, head to a sickness she'd never seen before, and didn't fully understand until it was over. The story of people who build things is not a story of constant momentum. It's a story of doing the work on the days when the work feels pointless, and then doing it again. In 1890, Margaret and Caleb Arden transferred a 15% stake in the A-Bar Ranch to a trust for the children of ranch employees. Ezra, still the foreman, now 31, with a house and a wife and a stake that had appreciated beyond anything he'd imagined when she'd first offered it, received a full 12% share outright. Clara Harwick, by then 22, and running the A-Bar's secondary operation out of Mora County, received 3% and the title of regional manager. Chester Harwick, who was 61 and had developed a grudging and quietly furious respect for the woman he'd sent for, as a joke 11 years earlier, received a one-time payment for the road access rights he'd held since 1880. He cashed the check without comment. In the 21st century, we often talk about disruption like it's a dramatic event, a sudden shift, a visible moment where everything changes. But most real disruption doesn't work that way. It works the way Margaret Arden worked, early, quietly, with attention to the things other people have decided aren't worth their time. A ledger error nobody else caught, a channel nobody else thought to dig, water rights nobody else thought to share, fire breaks nobody else thought they'd need. Small decisions, made before the crisis, made in the ordinary, unglamorous daily texture of doing the work. That's what an empire actually looks like from the inside, not a coronation. A Tuesday morning at a kitchen table with the ledger open and the coffee getting cold. The A-Bar Ranch, that's what it was still called. That simple board with the simple name that Margaret had put up in her first week, that Caleb had never asked about and never needed to, operated continuously under the Arden family for 37 years. When Margaret Arden died in 1904 at the age of 59, the operation covered 61,000 acres, employed over 120 people, and was valued at a sum that made the territorial newspaper print the number twice because the typesetter didn't believe it the first time. Her obituary in the Albuquerque Daily Citizen described her as a pioneering figure in New Mexico cattle operations. It did not mention Dustfall Creek. It did not mention a stagecoach, a bent yellow flower, or the men who'd thought they were sending a joke. Some stories are bigger than the people who tried to make them small. This has been a story about what happens when cruelty miscalculates, when it underestimates the person it's aimed at so completely that the weapon becomes a door. What would you have done, stepping off that stagecoach? Would you have turned around? I'd genuinely like to know. Drop it in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Not because it's inspirational in the easy, framed quote sense, but because it's true in the way that useful things are true. Specifically, practically, and without flattery. One last thing. The story you just watched is an artistic reconstruction built with the help of artificial intelligence. The characters, events, dialogue, and narrative details have been created or dramatized for storytelling purposes. While the setting and historical period are based on real conditions of the American West in the late 19th century, this video does not claim to document specific real individuals or verified historical events. For accurate historical information about the Wild West era, ranching operations, and the role of women in the American frontier economy, we encourage you to explore academic sources, historical archives, and publications from institutions such as the Smithsonian, the Library of Congress, and university history departments. History is richer than any single story, and there are real ones out there waiting for you.